All right. Hello, hello, hello. It's time to talk about maps. Maps. It's RPG a Day month, which means every day we are talking about a different topic or like some of these are topics, some of them are like super specific, but they're these words in this calendar that we're going to talk about every day. And yesterday was scenario. We had a good talk yesterday about scenarios. Ultimately ending in me saying I don't like them very much, or at least maybe the common way that we think about scenarios. And today is map day two. I'm very excited about tomorrow. Tomorrow's tactic, and I feel like tactical combat is in the air right now in the RPG space, so it'll be fun talking about tactics then. Um, so maps. Maps is an interesting one to talk about because there's a billion different kinds of maps, right? There's world maps, which are maybe helpful if you're living, if you're playing a large spanning campaign of some sort where you would actually need to track travel and probably in an existing world. Um, there you go. That's helpful. When I did my long-term fantasy campaign, it was in a map that was built with time, right? That we explored as we moved around it, and that was interesting. That was fun. Um, which is sort of reminds me then of like maybe like West Marches. I think West Marches is maybe my favorite use of a map, or like favorite genre of using maps in general. When we're talking about that macro level, when we're talking about large scale continents and worlds and stuff like that. Gate kept. Thank you very much. Welcome. Um, so that stuff though, I rarely use personally. I rarely play campaigns that are set in a place that is big enough where uh, a world map would be useful to us. Um, there are exceptions to that. For example, the map that came out in Light is pretty cool, but it's not like a map that you specifically move on. It's general. It's more like a rather than a hex crawl, it's like a point crawl sort of thing. And I think that's neat. The heart map is very good. Very true, Ty. And maybe we should talk about the heart map and why it's so good and connect that to this idea of like macro level maps as, in my opinion, ultimately not very interesting unless done in a special cool way like the heart map. I don't know where my heart map is. It's somewhere in this apartment. But basically, the way the heart does it is you're exploring this multi-tiered nightmare realm called the heart, and it's a hex map that you literally put stickers down as you explore and find key locations throughout your campaign so that your map is different than everybody else's map. And ultimately, if you travel one path to to the heart itself, all your characters die or retire or whatever horrible thing happens to them, then another group can come in from another angle and maybe encounter none of the things that you found along the way. Maybe they might meander and walk into your path, but it's a cool way to continuously build a map out that again has player buy-in. I think maybe that's the big thing that for me I struggle with maps is very similar to yesterday, where I think we ultimately landed on, and I was talking a little bit with Sean Drake about this afterwards. Um, Scenarios are not interesting to me when they're preordained. Scenarios built based off of player buy-in because of things like beats are really interesting to me. Same thing with maps. Like a map that's pre-made is like not interesting to me. There, at least in things like Powered by the Apocalypse games, like Apocalypse World or Dungeon World and things like that, they tell you to intentionally leave gaps in the map so that you can fill them up as a table. But like the pre-made stuff is, I think in general you can tell that I just don't like pre-made stuff. Um, but the heart map is so special. It's so fun to see how your map is going to come together compared to how other people might put their map. And you're going to go through experiences totally different, and that fits the theme of the game. That's a big part of it too, is that the map of Heart works because the heart is specifically a realm that shifts and changes itself to fit what it believes the desires of the inhabitants of the heart want. Um, and so it makes sense then that the players are equally sort of contributing to the map itself because the map wants to be made by the players rather than by the GM. And I think that is very cool, very interesting. Other maps, though, like not big macro maps, but like smaller maps, like battle maps, that's interesting. I was thinking about maps just a little bit earlier because I knew that was what we were talking about today, and I equate collecting battle maps to collecting fonts. If you start getting into graphic design and layout and stuff like that, I have a shit ton of fonts, like so many fonts. So many that there's no way that I could ever even remember what fonts that I've downloaded. And I'll ultimately kind of keep coming back to the same 5 to 10 fonts because they're the ones that I'm most familiar with and I know generally what they fit for. And I've got so many that I went and found. And I did the same thing for a period of time with battle maps. I downloaded tons and tons and tons of battle maps because anytime somebody would post something on like Reddit or Twitter, it would be like, here's this cool battle map for this specific situation. And I'd be like, you never know when I might need to have this crashed pirate ship map in a campaign. Let me download this, put it in my folder so I have it just in case. And so I've got all these maps. And how many of them did I use? About five, maybe, right? It's this very similar phenomenon to the collecting of fonts. Oh, my dog is very mad at somebody outside. Oh, it's because there's a tiny puppy outside. Oh, this is gonna be a good day for Clover. Um, so yeah, I battle maps are interesting, and I forget who was saying this on Twitter because somebody was talking about maps earlier with their RPGaDay thing, and they were talking about how the transition from being at like a macro level or even not a macro level but like at an in narrative stance and then shifting into battle stance, which means like unfurling the grid onto the table, putting the battle map down, is extremely um, breaking of your immersion. I thought that was an interesting point. Like it totally pulls you out of things, I feel like, when you pull out a gridded map and you are in a very narrative space. And I'm not saying that's inherently bad. I'm not saying that I wouldn't do that in my own games, but I had never considered that before. And I'm wondering how we could deal with that. What could be done about that in terms of easing that transition from narrative stance to tactical battle stance, because that's when you use battle maps in those sorts of games, right? You don't use it in a Powered by the Apocalypse game. So I thought that was an interesting point, and it's not one that I have the solution to at all, um, because I had never thought about that until this moment. Other maps that are out there that people use are in terms of like combat stuff. So you got your gridded battle maps. Then you've got like like didn't the Star Wars people from Fantasy Flight put out a thing? Uh, Star Wars map. Didn't they do that? Didn't they make a battle map for this? That wasn't this, that it was an abstracted range thing? Something like this, but this is somebody else's thing. I swear Fantasy Flight made something like this so that you could, yeah, here you go. So like I don't think Fantasy Flight made this, but anyway, this is the idea, right? That because they use abstracted ranges, you could use this to kind of like put like a token to identify who you are, where you are, and these sorts of things, and that would be a helpful way of tracking things without needing a specific map. The thing that's always been tricky with this, in my mind, and tricky I found with Nova, is maybe it does work with this map, and I've never tried it. Is you can be a close distance from one thing at the location you're at, and then a far distance from another thing, and how do you necessarily put that on the page when like your ally might be close to the person that's far? Like everybody's relative here, so these ranges don't feel like they would work to me if I'm understanding how relative range in this map works. But again, like I said, I've never used it, so maybe it's not the case. Oh, Ty's made an interesting point here. So that's how it works in Tiny D6 games. You have a play sheet like that, and all the enemies are at the center. Oh, that's interesting. So you put all the enemies at the center, and then you're tracking where you individually are from the concept of the enemies. Which again, it's tricky because if you assume the enemies are in one spot, then yeah, that works. But like if you're fighting in a tactical space where like the enemies are far away from each other, I don't know how this works. Yeah, it doesn't fully work. It's but why do we do this? Why do we have maps? Because theater of the mind, which is the alternative to this, is um, it breaks in a lot of games where you really need to track like details, like exact distance of things, but also the cognitive load, and that's a big thing about maps is cognitive load. So um, everybody has a different working memory capacity. Working memory is basically like the RAM of your brain. It's what you're currently able to think about. It's kind of like your short-term memory. So whatever you're actively thinking about is what your working memory is working on, hence the name. Um, and we can relieve working memory capacity by using tools like maps. And maps then allow us to focus our limited capacity because treat working memory capacity as a fuel source. It's not something that you have an infinite amount of. You have a limited amount of it. And so a map then basically means, okay, this is powered by something else. I don't need to use the fuel of working memory to track this thing. I can use my working memory fuel on other stuff. And that's very helpful, right? Ty says his favorite way of range bands are really, really simplified from the Rune Hammer guy. There's two ranges, here and there. You're either here besides an enemy or there. That's great, right? You're either next to me or you're not next to me. That's actually I kind of love that. I kind of love that as just a simplified thing. And depending on how detailed you need to get with your combat, that could be satisfactory. I think maps being next to tactics on the calendar is really interesting because they go hand in hand with one another. When we're at this battle map stage, right? It's not that you must have one to have the other or something like that, but the Venn diagram in which they apply to one another is pretty deep, pretty overlapping. Um, but that's not to say that you need a map for a tactical game. And that's not to say that every game that has a map is a tactical game. Um, but I think there's an interesting overlap between these two. I'm trying to think of like examples of bigger maps or maps in general that I have like besides the heart map that Ty mentioned. Um, I like. Oh, I know what I've been thinking about. And this is something that I tried to solve a year ago and I didn't with Slayers. Slayers has this concept of an infinite city that it's just all these microcosms of neighborhoods next to each other and how are they connected. How do I make a map out of that? And what my ultimate plan was that I never followed through on was to basically like make these hex shaped cards that you could print out that would be the names of various districts, and you could build the map very similar to how the heart map ultimately turned out. This is before I knew how heart was doing things. You would build your own version of the city in Slayers through these hex things, and what I wanted to do was kind of like do a monthly release of one of these every month, and this is when I was overly ambitious about everything that I was going to do. So I guess this was more than a year ago. If this was Slayers, this must have been like 2 years ago. I was thinking about this. Um, but I think honestly, the most fun I've ever had with maps are not battle maps. Never had. I don't think I've ever seen a battle map that really like made me feel like I was in the fight more than I would be if it was just kind of a blank grid and that we could kind of maybe like make some little sketches on if it was a dry erase grid or something like that. Are the maps that are the most interesting to me are the ones that are big with filled with holes that we fill together at the table. And I think that's sort of going to be a running theme moving into a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about this week. Um, or just this month in general, is that I like that table built stuff. I think that's really kind of it for maps. There's not a lot to say necessarily, just because honestly, most of the games that I play don't use maps. And so, both from a macro level and a micro level, I don't really have tons and tons and tons of stuff to say. The one thing I will say is that I am going to try and have some maps made, but they will be sort of like large scale macro maps that are useful for like just setting stuff. So, for example, in Spire, you can see this abstracted map of the city of Spire, but even this is not precise. It just gives you vague ideas of where things are. It's not a detailed map of everything. Actually, I just remembered the best time I've ever had with a map is with Blades in the Dark, which is maybe counterintuitive to the stuff that I've been saying because Blades in the Dark is a fully written out map. Um, yes, we have, Alex. We've talked about that at the beginning about how much we love the heart map. It's the coolest. Absolutely love that map so much. Love the premise of it. But what I was just realizing is that kind of maybe counter to what I had been saying so far is that I think my favorite experience with a map I've had is with Blades in the Dark, which is a fully detailed map in terms of like the city, and you get there's somebody out there whose name I have forgotten but has like a Patreon where you can get like detailed block by block maps of Duskfall that has like the names of the shops and everything. Like that's too granular for me, but like what John did by putting together the map in Blades, the reason I had so much fun with that is even though it's set, it's created, the districts are there, um, all that stuff is loose, like in terms of like what those buildings represent. And I think the only reason I had the most fun with it is because I treated it like the hex map of Heart, where uh, my players, because I had 3 campaigns in Blaze at the same time in the same city, all started in different places, and they all got access to the same map. They had their own individual maps, and then there would be a general map that would represent changes in the city that would be citywide that other people would be aware of. And that was a really cool narrative tool to show the connection between the campaigns. I paired that up with a newspaper that I would write between sessions with fake articles about the events that happened in sessions, and that was the most fun I ever had with the map. That was very very cool. Which again though is all player driven in terms of the impact of the map and everything like that. I think that's just my vibe. I think that's just the stuff that I like. So today's a shorter day. Today's, maps, like I said, there's not a whole lot to say. I remembered the thing that I want to do or that I love the most with maps, which is the blades. I'm going to make more maps in my games. Corvid Court and Seasons, I think, are going to have some new maps to them, so that'll be fun to have. I got to figure out how that's all going to work. But otherwise, that's maps. If somebody could figure out how to uh, to adequately handle the transition from narrative stance to battle stance in terms of your immersion as you roll out a battle map that doesn't exactly fit the description that you just were talking about, and then everybody else wasn't thinking the exact same thing. Um, Tell me what that solution is, because I don't know what it is off the top of my head, other than a blank grid, right? A blank grid that everybody can just imagine their own thing. But all this to say that even though I don't really use them very much, is we know that from a psychological perspective, from working memory capacity perspective, they are very helpful. The only little mini tip I have is to have initiative rolled at the end of last combat. So when you say that, Ty, just so that I understand, the tip is, so you're like in the middle of a fight, you or not, you're wrapping up a fight. All the enemies are taken care of or routed. You have all the players roll initiative and just like kind of note that score on the side so that the next time you get into combat, those scores move over, and then it's just like enemies that might need to roll initiative. Oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting idea. There was a period of time where House Slayer's initiative worked. Yes, roll initiative is a long bookkeeping process. I agree. There was a time, it was like version 2 of my early drafts of Slayers, where uh, it wasn't using the 4+ hit system where everything was 4+. You had DCs, like you had or ACs, that armor class equivalents that you had to hit, but your AC was equal to your initiative score. So basically, initiative was a representation of combat readiness rather than speed. And so if you had a really high initiative score, it was just really hard to hit you because you were the most prepped for initiative. And then like a lot of the moves for enemies and stuff was about fucking with Slayer's initiative scores, like dropping them, making them re-roll it, moving things around. But then also there were moves that were about being able to do more or less damage to people higher or lower than you in the initiative track. It was a really interesting premise that became exactly like you just said, Ty. A it was a bookkeeping process, to put it kindly. It was a nightmare as the GM to try and track it. We did like a few playtests of it, and we were like, nope, it's a really fun premise, but not fun in practice. So we dropped that. But that's an interesting idea. I like that idea of maybe having at least just that thing move along with you between things. Anything you can do to get that to get into combat stance is going to be interesting. Which reminds me of Icon, the game that um, the Lancer guy Abaddon just released, um, which has like two different things. Like you have your class that is outside of combat, and then you have your class slash job, which is your combat class. Two totally different rule systems. So you want to talk about immersion breaking, there's that, but I think it could be really cool. We'll talk about that with tactics tomorrow because that's a tactical game. That'll be fun. I think that's good for maps. That was a good little talk. I was going to do some design work, but there's a tiny 6-pound puppy right outside my apartment door that I want to go play with. So I'm gonna go do that, and then maybe I'll be back later for some seasons and stuff like that. Oh no, Alex! Uh, I would show you her. She's outside with that 6-pound puppy. I gotta go play with them right now. Um, so anyway, I'm gonna go do that. Thank you all so much for coming and talking to me about maps, thinking about map. Tomorrow's gonna be fun. Tomorrow's tactics, and I got a lot to say about tactics. So I'm really, really excited about the next couple days. They're gonna be really, really fun. So have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.